In 1953, Iran had a democracy. It had a parliament. It had a free press. It had a prime minister elected on the promise of taking back his country's oil from the British Empire. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and the CIA overthrew him. 26 years later, revolutionary students stormed the American embassy in Tehran, took 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, burning American flags and chanting, "Death to America." The White House acted as though this rage had come from nowhere, as though it were irrational. The rage made perfect sense. You just have to know the history. This is the story of how the CIA overthrew a democracy and got a theocracy instead. How a country that could have been America's closest ally in the Middle East became one of its most hostile adversaries. And how every step of that transformation was driven by the choices of men who believed they knew better than the people they governed. We're going to trace how a Cold War operation in 1953 led directly to the revolution of 1979, why Iran's new rulers turned out to be just as brutal as the old ones, and what it looks like when the consequences of empire come home. To understand why Iranians stormed that embassy, you have to understand what was taken from them. Mohammad Mossadegh was a European-educated aristocrat from one of Iran's oldest families. He had served in parliament, as a provincial governor, as finance minister. He wept in public. He gave speeches in his pajamas. Western diplomats didn't know what to make of him, but ordinary Iranians loved him because he said out loud what everyone already knew. Iran's oil belonged to Iran. By 1951, that oil had been controlled by a single British company for decades, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now known as BP. The terms were straightforward exploitation. The company paid more in taxes to the British Treasury than it paid in royalties to the country whose oil it was pumping out of the ground. Iranian workers lived in slums, while British executives lived in gated compounds with swimming pools. Iran's parliament elected Mossadegh as prime minister and voted to nationalize the oil. Britain's response was immediate: a naval blockade of the Persian Gulf, choking off Iran's exports and strangling the economy. When Mossadegh expelled British diplomats, correctly suspecting them of plotting against him, London turned to Washington for help. The Truman administration had actually seen Mossadegh as useful, a nationalist who could keep communism out of Iran. But when Eisenhower took office in 1952, British intelligence reframed the dispute. This wasn't about oil, they argued. This was about the Cold War. Mossadegh was unreliable. If he stayed, Iran would fall to the Soviets. It wasn't true, but it worked. The CIA codenamed the operation TP Ajax. The British called it Operation Boot. To understand the plan, you first need to know about the Shah. Shah is a title, not a name. It means king. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi had been Iran's monarch since 1941, when the British and Soviets forced his father to abdicate during the Second World War. He was young, insecure, and had spent most of his reign in the shadow of more powerful politicians, Mossadegh chief among them. Under Iran's constitution, the Shah had the power to dismiss the prime minister by royal decree. The CIA's plan was to get the Shah to use that power, sign a decree firing Mossadegh, and appoint a CIA-friendly general named Zahedi in his place. Then the military would enforce it. The problem was that the Shah was terrified. He knew that dismissing the most popular politician in Iran could end with his own overthrow. So before the decree could even be delivered, the CIA needed to weaken Mossadegh's support. They ran a campaign to turn the public against him. CIA agents paid Iranian journalists to write articles branding Mossadegh as corrupt and anti-Islamic. They hired provocateurs to pose as communists, staging violent attacks on mosques and threatening clerics, so that Iran's religious establishment would believe a Mossadegh government meant an atheist takeover. The goal was to isolate Mossadegh from his own people before removing him. After weeks of pressure, the Shah finally signed the decree. On the night of August 15, 1953, a military officer arrived at Mossadegh's home to deliver it. But Mossadegh had been tipped off. Loyalist soldiers arrested the officer on the doorstep, When the Shah heard the news, he fled the country, flying first to Baghdad and then to Rome. It looked like the coup had failed, but the CIA officer running the operation on the ground, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., refused to stop. On August 19th, he mobilized a second attempt. Paid crowds, recruited from the bazaars and the traditional gymnasiums, marched through Tehran chanting, "Long live the Shah." Police and military units that had been bribed in advance joined them. By the afternoon, tanks surrounded Mossadegh's home. Hours of fighting left between 200 and 300 people dead. Mossadegh escaped over his garden wall but surrendered the next day. His trial became famous. The 71-year-old prime minister appeared in gray pajamas and a bathrobe, presenting himself as the frail victim of empire. He fainted. He wept. He called the prosecutor an old hag. None of it saved him. Mossadegh was convicted of treason and spent the rest of his life under house arrest, dying in 1967. The Shah flew back from Rome and reclaimed his throne. Iran's experiment with democracy was over.
With Mossadegh gone, the Shah set about building the country he wanted, modern, Western, and completely under his control. In 1963, he launched the White Revolution, a sweeping package of reforms that he designed and imposed without any democratic process. Land was redistributed from feudal landlords to peasants. Women were given the vote. Literacy and health programs were rolled out across the country. The results looked impressive on paper. Per capita income tripled. Literacy rates climbed. But the reforms failed where it mattered. The land redistribution left peasants with plots too small to farm, pushing millions into the slums of Tehran and other cities. The bazaar merchants, the traditional commercial class, resented the rise of state monopolies that undercut their businesses. And the Shia clergy watched as their endowment lands were confiscated, and their authority over education and family law was stripped away. To hold all of this together, the Shah relied on Savak, his secret police. Savak was established with direct help from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, and it used the same methods that intelligence agencies across the Cold War relied on: surveillance networks, informants, indefinite detention, and systematic torture. This was not a new idea. At this time, France was using these same techniques against insurgents in Algeria. The United States was teaching them to military governments across Latin America. Savak brought them home to Iran. Savak agents operated in universities, factories, and coffee shops. Iranians learned to assume any conversation could be overheard. Over 2 decades, Savak dismantled every secular opposition movement in Iran: the nationalists, the socialists, the student groups. One by one, they were broken. But Savak could not shut down the mosques. You can ban a political party. You can arrest a union leader. You cannot close every mosque in a country where Shia Islam is woven into daily life. The mosque network had its own funding, its own communication channels, its own authority built over centuries. So when Iranians needed somewhere to organize, to speak, to resist, the mosque was the only space left. By crushing every moderate alternative, the Shah guaranteed that when the opposition finally came, it would be religious. The man who would fill that space was Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was a senior cleric in the holy city of Qom, and unlike other religious leaders who negotiated quietly with the court, he attacked the Shah directly. In 1963, he delivered a public sermon comparing the Shah to the Caliph Yazid, the ruler who, in 680 AD, ordered the killing of the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Hussein. For Shia Muslims, Hussein's death is the foundational story of their faith, the moment when a righteous man was murdered by a tyrant. Calling the Shah Yazid meant calling him an enemy of God. Khomeini was arrested. Riots erupted across Iran. The Shah's troops opened fire, killing hundreds. Hardliners in the regime wanted Khomeini executed, but cooler heads argued that killing a senior cleric would make things worse. So the Shah exiled him instead, first to Turkey, then to Najaf in Iraq. It was supposed to silence him. It did the opposite. From Iraq, Khomeini recorded sermons on cassette tapes. These tapes were smuggled into Iran. copied by the thousands in the bazaars, and played in mosques across the country. The Shah controlled television and the newspapers. He could not control a cassette tape. Khomeini had built an underground broadcast network that spoke to ordinary people in their own religious language, and the Shah had no way to stop it. Meanwhile, Iran was getting richer and more unequal. The 1973 oil crisis sent revenues through the roof, but the wealth stayed at the top. In North Tehran, the westernized elite threw parties where European wine flowed and women wore French fashion. If you look at photographs from 1970s Tehran, you see a city that could be mistaken for Southern Europe. Miniskirts, nightclubs, unveiled women on university campuses. But in South Tehran, families of 8 lived in single rooms without running water, listening to Khomeini's cassettes on borrowed tape players. The Shah seemed blind to the gap. He spent $200 million on a celebration at Persepolis to mark 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. Food flown in from Paris served on Limoges china, while rural Iranians went hungry. In 1975, he dissolved all political parties and declared a single-party state, forcing every Iranian to join or leave the country. Then, on New Year's Eve 1977, President Jimmy Carter raised a glass in Tehran and called Iran an island of stability. Within 12 months, the island was on fire. The spark was an insult. In January 1978, a government newspaper published a hit piece on Khomeini, calling him a British agent and accusing him of writing erotic poetry. Seminary students in Qom protested. Police opened fire, killing several. In Shia Islam, you hold a memorial 40 days after a death. So 40 days later, mourners gathered in Tabriz to honor the Qom victims. The memorial turned into a riot. More people were killed. 40 days after Tabriz, more memorials in more cities. More protests, more killings. The regime had accidentally built a machine it could not turn off. Every killing produced a new round of grief, and every memorial became a new demonstration. The 40-day cycle fed itself, and the government kept giving it fuel. By August 1978, the country was close to ungovernable. Then, on September 8th, thousands of protesters gathered in Jaleh Square in Tehran. Many didn't know that martial law had been declared. Troops, backed by helicopter gunships, opened fire into the crowd. After that day, known as Black Friday, the word reform disappeared from the protest slogans. The new chant was simple: death to the Shah. Throughout the crisis, the Shah was strangely passive. Unknown to the public, unknown even to the CIA, he was dying of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was heavily medicated, swinging between small concessions and crackdowns, satisfying no one. By January 1979, it was over. On the 16th, the Shah drove to Mehrabad airport. The monarch of Iran wept openly as he shook hands with his officials. His hands trembled. He carried a small box of Iranian soil, taken from a country he would never see again. He boarded the Royal Boeing 707 and piloted it himself on the first leg to Egypt. When asked why he was leaving, his answer was, "I am tired." Tehran erupted. Statues were toppled. Citizens danced in the streets and cut the Shah's face out of banknotes. 16 days later, on February 1st, Ayatollah Khomeini returned. He flew on a chartered Air France 747, accompanied by 120 journalists. As the plane entered Iranian airspace, ABC News correspondent Peter Jennings asked him, "What do you feel in returning to Iran?" Khomeini's answer was a single word: "Hiç." Nothing. To Western audiences, it was unsettling. A man returning to lead a nation who claimed to feel nothing about it. To his followers, it was proof of total spiritual devotion. A leader who acted only for God, not for himself. Between 3 and 5 million people met him at the airport. It was one of the largest gatherings in human history. For 10 days, two governments existed side by side. The Shah's last prime minister clung to authority in one part of Tehran, while Khomeini set up a rival headquarters in another. On February 9th, Air Force technicians mutinied. Armed groups rushed to support them. 2 days of street fighting later, the military declared neutrality rather than tear itself apart. The revolution was won. But the question of who owned it was only beginning. The coalition that toppled the Shah was broad. Islamists, Marxists, liberal Democrats, feminists, student movements, trade unions. They agreed on one thing: the Shah had to go. Once he was gone, they turned on each other. Khomeini appointed Mehdi Bazargan as prime minister. Bazargan was a pious Muslim, but he was also a Democrat. He wanted an elected government that respected human rights and maintained relations with the West, something closer to what Mossadegh might have built. But real power sat with Khomeini's Revolutionary Council, a closed circle of clerics, and with the armed street committees, called comites, that controlled entire neighborhoods. Bazargan had the title, Khomeini's people had the guns. Bazargan called himself a knife without a blade. In March, a referendum asked Iranians to vote yes or no on an Islamic Republic. It passed with 98%, but the ballot offered no other option: no secular republic, no constitutional monarchy, and the words Islamic Republic were left undefined. Bazargan and his allies imagined a democracy with Islamic character. Khomeini had something else in mind. Over the summer, an assembly packed with Islamists drafted a constitution that placed supreme power in the hands of a single religious leader. Then came the event that sealed everything. In October 1979, President Carter admitted the dying Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. To Iranians, this looked like 1953 all over again. In 1953, the Shah had fled to Rome while the CIA organized his return. Now the Shah was in America, under American protection. The fear, and it was a real fear, shaped by lived experience, was that the Americans were going to restore him to power a second time. On November 4th, a group of radical students stormed the U.S. Embassy and took 52 Americans hostage. Khomeini had not ordered the takeover, but he recognized what it gave him. He endorsed it publicly, calling it a second revolution greater than the first. The crisis forced Bazargan to resign. He could not defend the seizure of an embassy and gave the clerics a weapon against every domestic opponent. Anyone who disagreed could now be called an American agent. The hostages were held for 444 days. More than a year of blindfolded diplomats paraded on television, of failed rescue missions, including a disastrous helicopter operation in the Iranian desert that killed 8 American soldiers, of a superpower humiliated in front of the world. The crisis destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency and defined Iran in Western eyes for a generation. And during those 444 days, while the world was focused on the embassy, the clerics were quietly locking down control of the state. With Bazargan gone and the Democrats discredited, the clerics turned on the groups that still had the power to challenge them, the armed left. The revolution had been a joint effort. Khomeini's followers had provided the mass support, but much of the actual street fighting in February 1979, the battles at the air bases, the storming of military barracks, had been carried out by guerrilla organizations. The largest was the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, or MEK, an armed group that blended Islamist and Marxist ideas. They had thousands of trained fighters. There were also the Fedayeen, a secular leftist guerrilla group, and the Tudeh Party, Iran's communists, who were aligned with the Soviet Union. All of them had fought the Shah. All of them expected a place in the new Iran. None of them got one. In 1980, the regime launched what it called a cultural revolution. Universities, the centers of secular and leftist thought, were shut down for 3 years. Thousands of professors and students were fired, arrested, or forced into exile. When the campuses reopened, the curriculum had been rewritten along Islamic lines. The first elected president of the new republic, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, tried to resist the cleric's takeover and was impeached. He escaped the country by hijacking an Air Force jet to Paris. Then came open war. In June 1981, the MEK bombed the headquarters of the ruling party, killing over 70 senior officials. The regime responded with mass executions. Revolutionary tribunals ran day and night. Thousands of MEK members and other leftists were killed in 1981 and 1982. The communists were last. The Tudeh party had actually supported the Islamic Republic, hoping to steer it closer to the Soviet Union. In 1983, the regime banned them, arrested their leaders, and forced them onto television to confess that they were Soviet spies and to denounce their own beliefs. And this is where the story of 1970s Iran comes full circle. Those photographs from pre-revolution Tehran, the miniskirts, the nightclubs, the women on university campuses with their hair uncovered, belonged to a country that no longer existed. The new regime imposed mandatory hijab. Women who had marched alongside men to bring down the Shah found their rights taken away by the republic that replaced him. The freedom in those photographs was gone, and the secular movements that might have defended it had been destroyed, first by Savak under the Shah, then by the clerics after the revolution. By 1983, the consolidation was complete. The monarchy was dead, the Democrats were in exile, the leftists were in graves. The Islamic Republic stood alone. In 1953, the United States overthrew Iran's elected government. The reason was the Cold War. Washington feared that Mossadegh's standoff with Britain would destabilize Iran and open the door to Soviet influence. Britain wanted its oil back. Together, they removed the one secular, democratic leader who had the legitimacy to govern and handed the country to a dictator. What followed took 26 years to play out. The Shah's dictatorship crushed every moderate opposition group and left the mosque as the only surviving political space. Khomeini filled that space. The revolution, when it came, was religious because the secular alternatives had already been eliminated. The 1979 hostage crisis, the chance of death to America, the decades of hostility, none of this appeared from nowhere. The students who stormed that embassy said so themselves. They called it retaliation for 1953. The men who planned Operation Ajax considered it a success. In the short term, it was. They got their Shah back. They got their oil contracts. They got 26 years of a cooperative ally. But they also got Savak and the slums of South Tehran. They got the cassette tapes and the 40-day cycle and Black Friday. They got the embassy. And Iran got a revolution that consumed its own children. The Democrats who wanted freedom were pushed aside within months. The leftists who fought in the streets were executed within years. The women who marched for equality had their rights taken by the state they had helped create. By 1983, the only people left standing were the clerics, and they built a system of surveillance, detention, and forced confession that looked very similar to the one they had overthrown. Different ideology, same methods. Every empire tells itself the same story, that the people it governs cannot govern themselves, that intervention is necessary, that stability matters more than freedom, that the consequences are someone else's problem. Iran is what happens when those consequences come home.